I'm very pleased today to have an opportunity to again interview Miss Charlotte Reese. Uh, it was just Columbus Day, and now we're going to talk about ancient Chinese being in the Americas. And ancient, how ancient? And I'm going to ask her, and we're going to run through the previous show in terms of topics and move on to the documentation that now exists because it's quite interesting and important. As I've often said, American history is filled with inconsistencies and mythologies. And slowly and quietly, we're moving towards hidden and unknown facts of the past. So I'm very pleased to have you here today.
Thank you.
And how ancient is ancient before we get into the meat?
Well, the Chinese themselves say that their first dynasty started around 2000 BC. 14 years ago, the Chinese government completed an extensive study with over 400 academic people from different disciplines, and they determined that their first dynasty started about 2070 BC. So in my writing, I rounded off to 2000 BC just to make it easier.
Okay. And the people were there before the dynasties, so, and I'm sure they were organized, but maybe not in such a sophisticated manner. So ancient China is ancient China. It goes
Right.
back along with the Egyptians and other people in other parts of the world.
Right, right.
And they were talking to each other. They knew about each other's existence, strange
Right.
as it may seem, and the distances were prohibitive and the oceans were vicious and their ships were not as large as they are today, which even get into trouble. But the
Right.
Chinese had fairly sophisticated ships that were built. And of course, they knew about magnetism, had found a lodestone that gave them the magnetic compass concept, and they used it.
Right, and Dr. Kent Dung from the London School of Economics wrote a book that's actually being used as a college textbook, and it's Chinese Maritime and Economic Development 2100 BC through 1900 AD. So 2100 BC, he has Chinese going to sea.
Good. Do you know who published this book? Well,
It
not
was one
roughly.
of the academic presses.
Okay, so it can be easily found.
Right, it can be found on Amazon.
Okay, well, that's a book I think I'd like to put my hands on. And before we get into the stuff, there was an embryologist by the name of, who wrote the volumes, got Chinese scholars to do the Needham.
Oh, yes, Joseph Needham
Oh, yes.
is considered the leading Caucasian scholar of all things Chinese from the 20th century. And he wrote volumes and volumes about ancient China and how advanced they were. And he has very well-documented works about how early Chinese were advanced. Chinese had writing, they were making silk 2000 BC, they were cultivating gardens, they had domesticated animals 2000 BC, so they were quite advanced.
And they also had, by the 4th century, rules and regulations for seasoning logs and wood, and detailed specific directions for construction.
Right, right. And some of Needham's works have been reproduced by a man named Robert Temple in a book called The Genius of China. And he put it down into layman's language because Needham, as you know, his works are very complicated to read. And Robert Temple distilled them into a book called The Genius of China.
Okay.
And that's also available on Amazon.
Good, good. So the Chinese writings of the past have being reproduced and made more simple and more, what shall I say, user-friendly,
Right.
and are available for people to look at, read, and I'm sure picture books are going to come out for young children on some of this. It's very interesting, but Needham hired Chinese scholars to help to produce the many volumes. About how many, did he get to 17 or 18 volumes?
I'm
Because
not
I
sure.
had 3 I had 3 volumes. And as the price began to go up, I backed off, and I'm sorry I did.
And most people will have to go to a library to read
Yes,
them.
yes, definitely. This is a not for what should you say? Not for taking out of the library, not for
Right.
taking home, but for scholarly research in the reserved areas.
And
of
that's
the
what I've had to do,
library.
is
Yes,
go to a library to read them.
Right, right. But it's worth it. It's worth
Mm-hmm.
it. Well, let's talk about you. Your father was a Baptist missionary to
Correct.
China.
Correct.
And you were born in China.
No, I wasn't born in
you-
China, but I went when I was 5 years old.
Okay,
I
well,
went to Asia. I wasn't in China proper because at that time China was closed to the Western world. And so we lived first in Taiwan
Okay.
and then later in Hong Kong.
All right.
So
But you learned Chinese.
yes, I learned Mandarin as a young child.
Okay. Which not too many people who are Caucasian were learning at that time.
Correct.
Were there lots of missionaries of different persuasions in China, in Hong Kong at that time? Do you have any sense?
Yes,
of-
there were quite a few missionaries in Hong Kong from all different denominations and Catholic, a lot of different missionaries in Hong Kong. In Taiwan, my father was one of the first Caucasians that was invited in, and he was actually invited in by General Chennault.
Really?
Yes, and that's one of the next books I'm going to write is a story about my father's life, which is very interesting, and also my grandparents, including my grandparents who were missionaries in China, and my father was born in Kaifeng, China.
My goodness, okay.
Um,
So you're an honorary Chinese?
I hope so. I hope so. They have a proud tradition.
Yes, that's interesting.
But you know, we're all related. DNA
Of
takes
course.
us back and says that all people are related. And so I tell high schools when I speak there, I say, you know, if people really understood this, they would treat each other better.
Well, I think they're afraid to. I think it's more fear and the sense of superiority that people give them of privilege and arrogance that they don't understand these things until it's too late. You know, if you start planting a seed in a child when they're very young, it's hard
Right.
to extract that seed as you get older
Right.
from your thinking. It's quite amazing what people do to people in terms of trying to control them. And it's all about control, really.
Right.
When you get right down to it. Power, control, money, whatever. It's all part of it. But the point is that your father was there, many missionaries were there. Have you any sense, I'm always curious, I know we're not on the topic here, but what drove a lot of missionaries to go to China? Did they think all these people were heathens and needed to be saved? Or how come people targeted China as a place to...
I'm sure that was what drove a lot of the missionaries there, both religious and physical help, because Chinese at that time did need help.
They were poor.
And they said that the Industrial Revolution drove a lot of the Europeans there some of them were taking advantage of the Chinese. And some people have written history that the missionaries were preying on the Chinese. I don't see any evidence of that in my family. In fact, my grandparents risked their lives to be in there when the Japanese occupied their part of China before America was at war with Japan, you know, before Pearl Harbor.
Oh,
So
long
they could
before.
help shelter some of the Chinese women from the Japanese soldiers.
Yes.
So they risked their lives in doing that, and crossing Japanese lines and bringing in food and medicine for the people that they were sheltering. They and the other missionaries in
Right.
their area were sheltering.
Okay. Well, you have been producing some documents which should shake a lot of people's little heads and brains and cause people to think a little differently than they have in the past. Because your father was there and collected maps and things of that sort, and identified the maps as having a validity
Right.
in terms of world history and the geography of the world. And these you put away, your 7 siblings put it away for a while as their life, they were taking care of their own life.
Right, correct.
So let's pick up from there quickly, and so we can get to the new documentation that I'm very anxious for you to talk about.
Well, my father found his map, his first map, world map, in Korea. And it's in a Korean map book, but this type of map that I've learned from my research actually descended from the Chinese. And may I hold this up, or
Of
would you
course.
hold it up and show the map there? It has, the red dots are China and Korea in the middle. And if you move over to a little bit to the left, you'll see Africa. And above that would be the Mediterranean and Europe. And we believe that this side is the west coast of the Americas, and this side is the east coast of the Americas.
So they split the Americas in half
Right.
on the map. Okay.
Right, and there's some American maps that are made that way. There's one by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, U.S. government, that shows the world that way too, because it's the easiest way to show the round world on a flat surface, and it shows how the ocean currents work.
Okay, fine, fine. Very interesting. All right, so that's one of the books. And this was another?
Right, well this was the first version of this book.
Okay.
And so in 2014, I brought it back out under this new title and expanded it, and with a different publisher, so I've changed the title of it. But Chinese Sailed to America Before Columbus was the name of that one, and now it's called New World Secrets on Ancient Asian Maps. But it not only discusses my father's maps, but it discusses other Asian maps. For instance, the 1602 map, which was made in China with the collaboration of a Roman Catholic priest, Matteo Ricci. It has information on it about horses and buffalo on the Great Plains. Well, the white people didn't get to the Great Plains until 200 years later when Lewis and Clark went. So how did they know that there were horses and buffalo on the Great Plains? And because people had been there before, and the Chinese had this information. In fact, when the Caucasians first came to the New World, they started drawing maps, not only of the East Coast where they had seen, but of the whole West Coast. How did they know what was on the West Coast? How did they know the Bering Strait was there? Because they were getting information from other sources.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah, it's very interesting what people do, and they're anxious to do certain things and promote certain concepts. And here is a cover that's very interesting, where we have a Native American and a Chinese-looking youngster
Right.
together.
And the Native Americans do have the type of DNA that is from Asia. And so they say their founding DNA is from Asia. And so the question now is, did they come by boat or by land? More and more people are moving away from the land theory, the land bridge theory, and going to that they came by boat because of the current in the North Pacific that's bringing all kinds of debris over. So they could have come over even on a raft with no sail because it pushes objects over. That current is 62 miles wide and half a mile deep. It's like a giant riptide, and right now it's pushing all much of the debris from the Japanese tsunami over. And people on the west coast of the U.S. are very concerned about maybe microscopic organisms that are coming across that their coast isn't used to.
Okay.
So,
well, you know, there's a lot to look at and a lot to think about.
Right, and that's an abridgment of my father's book, the book that he wrote in 1973. And his book was almost 800 pages long, and I said, nobody's going to read an 800-page book. So I abridged it. So that was the first book that I wrote when I started. After I did this research, I said, well, someone has to condense it. And after I asked my 6 other siblings, would you do it? Would you do it? Would you do it? Guess who did it?
Well, to go from 600 pages down to this is quite a feat.
So it makes the story a little bit shorter and gives
clearer.
the concepts.
And clearer. Well, it's very, very interesting. Now, the one that I want to talk about, but of course, we're skipping a lot of things that happened in between that you've been following and talking with people. You've gone to Congress with some early maps, which they sat on.
Right, the Library of Congress, our father's map collection was at the Library of Congress for 3 years, and then I had the opportunity to speak at the Library of Congress in 2005. And I've also spoken at the National Library of China and at China's 2 top universities, which are Tsinghua University and Peking University. And when I spoke at Peking University last December, it was a very interesting reaction because some of the students said, no, this document can't possibly be true. And others were saying, yes, we've been there. We know that what she's saying is true. And there's much documentation in the Americas that Chinese came early, including the names of 2 early Chinese kings. And a leading scholar from UC Berkeley has looked at the type of writing. He says the patina on the rock is very old, and he's dated at 1200 to 200 BC. And these etchings are on rocks in New Mexico, and yet the man that found them and the other man that's validated them, he can't get press in the United States to cover this.
Well, people don't like their old ideas tossed out of the window, so it's going to take a long time for it to seep into
Right. Well,
the
they want Columbus to be
consciousness
first.
Well, they're not even sure about Columbus. I
Right.
have a book in Spanish, which I cannot read, that is from Sweden about Columbus. And there's some things in there that don't quite fit with what we have been told about
Right,
Columbus
right.
and his trips and so forth. So there's going to be a lot of talk back and forth and a lot of controversy.
Right.
And maybe when we begin to dissect this, we will come closer to some basic facts. Now, this book, Did Chinese Explore the Americas? And this is the one, America, and this is the one you've been working at. And I say the
Right.
Americas because if they were down as far as Mexico, they're practically going down to the Panama Canal and,
Right.
and down into South America and across almost the southern part of the United States. So,
Right. Well, let me give you a little bit of the background on this.
Please.
In 1953, a Chicago attorney named Henrietta Mertz, she was a patent attorney, but she was also very interested in history. And she took this Chinese legend that was from 2000 BC, reportedly from 2000 BC. And she took the English translation of it, which she checked with the Library of Congress, and I have since checked with the National Library of China to see if this is an accurate translation. And she took topographical world maps and says this fits, what they're describing fits nowhere else in the world but North America. Now what this document says is go so far and you'll see this. Go so far, and the distances are in Chinese li, which is about 1/3 of a mile.
Okay.
So they would do about 300 li between each stop, so it would be 99 to 100 miles between each stop. And they'd say, okay, here you're going to see this, the river's going to flow north or northeast, and these minerals will be here, these animals will be here, and then they would describe them. And so she said this fits nowhere else in the world, and she took the Chinese legend of the Eastern Mountains. Now what's east of China but the ocean? And this goes a very long distance. The one that I followed through the Rocky Mountains went for 1,100 miles. And so it's a long distance, so it was too big to be on, say, Japan. And she said, besides, the descriptions fit nowhere else in the world. Well, in these descriptions are several north-flowing rivers, and they're named in correct sequence. They describe several animals native only to North America in correct habitats, and time after time, going down this 1,100-mile route, I was able to verify 93% of what they wrote 4,000 years ago. Now this area, I must say in fairness, this area is mostly national parks and nature conservancies, so it's probably still much as it was long ago.
Right.
Right.
That's incredible. That's
It is. It
quite
is.
incredible.
And I went with, oh, come on, we're not going to really find this. I mean, this is just
Now you went
too
with your
crazy.
husband who did the photography,
Right, right.
and who else?
Well, I did the first part of the trip. I did the southern portion.
Oh, okay. Around Mexico?
Well, no, this
Not
was in
so far.
Texas.
Okay, Texas. all right.
Texas. I did it with my brother.
Which is Mexico.
well,
Was Mexico.
Right, right. It's very close to Mexico.
No, it was Mexico because most of Texas was Mexico.
You're exactly right.
Yeah,
You're exactly right. So I did the southern portion first. I did that in 2009, just to see if that could be right, because they were describing, how I got my brother to go was, they were describing a gold mine there. So I said to my brother, what if I could tell you where to find gold?
That got his interest.
That got his interest, so he went with me. We never did find the gold mine. We think we know where the gold mine was, and I discussed that in the book. But you know, if they did find gold, surely they were smart enough to take what they saw.
And cover up the rest.
Yeah, right. But we believe we know where the gold mine was, and I discussed that in the book. But we went to this one mountain that they called Bald Mountain. The Chinese call it Bald Mountain. We call it in America Baldy Peak, and it's in Texas. And they said at this location, there's this little animal that looks like a suckling pig or a very small pig. And Henrietta Mertz, even though she charted this, she never was able to go herself. You know, she was an older woman, she was single, she didn't have somebody to climb these mountains with. And I wouldn't have gone if I didn't have my brother, you know, going, or my husband going with me. So anyway, sure enough, there were those little pigs. They weigh about 40 pounds. And but they said, but they have pearls. And Henrietta Mertz says, I think these are peccary. And sure enough, they were there, running wild, running there. And they have their tusks stick out just at the corner of their mouth and look like little pearls in the corner of their mouth. They're the only pig-like animal native to North America, as I did my research.
Really?
So we were standing on the top of the Baldy Peak, and we were looking down at the Chihuahuan Desert, and I was looking at what she had written, and she says, and the next mountain to the south is going to be Bamboo Mountain. I said, no way. There's not going to be bamboo in dry West Texas. I was looking at the Chihuahuan Desert and said, there's not going to be bamboo. But next day we go to the museum. And we said, is there anything that looks like bamboo in West Texas? Yeah, river cane. So find out, it's the only bamboo native to North America, and it's right in the location where she charted it.
Huh.
So anyway, I was saying too much matches up for this not to be true. But several years passed and we hadn't finished the rest of the trip because it starts in Wyoming and goes south. So finally, in 2012, I talked to my husband, I said, we've got to go, we've got to go. But then meanwhile, I'm saying, oh, are we going to go and find nothing? So anyway, we ended up going in 2012 and starting in Wyoming went south.
That was quite a trip.
Right, right. But then I get up there and I say, why would Chinese start in the middle of North America? Well, then I realized that Mertz had charted 4 trips in the Chinese document. This one in Wyoming is listed first, but 2 others, one is right along the coast, and it starts in Alaska and goes down the coast. So I think that's where the Chinese port of entry, you know, it was almost like a boat trip down the coast.
Okay. That makes some sense.
And then there was another one that was just a little bit inland from that. It started at Mount Rainier and went south, and where it ended was right where the California Trail went through the Rocky Mountains. So then I said, okay, well maybe this makes sense. When we get to Casper, Wyoming, there's a National Park Service museum, and they said, okay, this is right where the California Trail, the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Pony Express all went through the mountains because it's the only good pass through the mountains. So then it made sense. Okay, this might be where the Chinese came going from west to east through the mountains.
And supposedly that spot was found by an African American going through there. And I have to give you the name of the book because I can't come up with the exact title at this moment. The Pass.
That's very interesting,
Yes,
right?
I do. I may have the book at home. I'll see.
But anyway, in that area, they described, okay, there's an animal here, and it's striped. And before I went, I said, what animal in North America is striped? You know, I know zebra, you know, and it's the size of cattle. What is it? Went out there, and it's the pronghorn or antelope, where the deer and the antelope play. You know?
Okay.
It has these stripes across its chest.
Okay.
And that's a Native American animal, and there are more antelope in that area than there are people in Wyoming. They're running wild in that area. And also in that area are astronomical devices. That's bighorn medicine wheel that with 28 spokes unevenly spaced around a hub. And because my research mentor, Dr. Covey, who passed late last year, but he had let's see, I think we have a picture of him here somewhere. He had helped me with all of my research, and Dr. Covey, anyway, he had had me study
a little longer.
a little bit longer. He had had me study Chinese archaeology first before I started in on the American, and I realized that Chinese also had in the second millennium BC. They charted the night sky, and they had 28 spokes, unevenly spaced around a hub. And when you put these two side by side, they look the same. Downriver from there is artwork, which academic artists have compared to artwork in Ningxia, China, from China's earliest dynasties. And then I studied further, and I was reading this book about Colorado archaeology, because after Wyoming, then we went to Colorado, and they talked about the McKean people. And these are people that they don't know who they are, but they came through Colorado and Wyoming, and actually went up into Canada. And the places that they went were the locations of Mertz's fourth journey. Exact, but they don't know who these people were, but they said they know they came through 2000 BC. Well, 2000 BC was the date I was looking at. You know, I said, okay, this document was supposedly written 2000 BC. These people came through 2000 BC. Their homes were built the same way. They were advanced people, but we can't find them in Europe, so we don't know who they are.
Well, they knew who they were. Were they very tall people or very small people?
Very small people, very small people, right. And they had even dug caves, and one of the caves had, not caves, but mines, and taken samples. And so one of the mines, the gold mines, had very small entrance, say like 6 foot diameter.
So only little people could get in there.
Right, right.
Interesting. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I subscribe to an archaeology magazine just to see what people are doing all over the world in archaeology. It's fascinating. Recently, they've come up with very huge skeletons, 7 feet and over, and then with very small people like the pygmies, and these people would fall into that in terms of size categories.
Right.
And I refused to send the magazine with all these different skulls, making believe these people are so different from each other that one of the magazines were featuring either that or Scientific American as evolution, but the skulls were very similar. And who says if we take a survey today, our skulls all don't look alike, and we certainly aren't.
No.
Evolved into another race of people, so I find it amusing.
We have basketball players that are about 7 feet tall too.
Now, certainly, but you know, when I was growing up, if you were 6 feet something, you were a monster, and now,
Right.
I don't know whether it's the hormones or the food or what, but it's not unusual to find very tall, big men now, 7 feet and more. And I've seen in this country a few people from China who are very, very tall, over 7 feet.
Right, right.
So they exist. And that doesn't mean that they had a pituitary disease either, because they featured someone on television who was very tall, And apparently his bones were not strong enough to bear the weight of his being that tall.
Right.
And they were citing this as a possible pituitary problem and sending him to a hospital to get treatment and see if they could strengthen his ability to stand and so forth. But who knows whether he was the exception to the rule. But they have unearthed a number of skeletons recently
Right.
of very
But
huge
on
people.
this trip, the first 5 stops, there were 12 stops, and the first 5 stops were on what is now the Continental Divide Trail. Now, the Continental Divide Trail was not even the Continental Divide Trail at the time that Henrietta Mertz wrote her book. But these were very old trails. And even the roads today, many of them are built one on top of the other. You know, that in my hometown in Virginia, some of these streets, they say, who built this, the cow?
Yes.
Because they go round, winding around and around.
Right,
But anyway, some of these were very old trails. And by following the rivers, which the Chinese described, this river will run into this river, and when you have several north-flowing rivers, you'd say, okay, how does one north-flowing river flow into the other? It has to eventually come south for it to, and so when you draw this configuration out, you see how all this fits together, and by following the river, we came to the 3rd stop, which was Longs Peak, Colorado.
Huh. Crazy.
And so again, they describe something that they say, this looks like the size of domesticated fowl. So I go back to Chinese archaeology books, and I said, what fowl had they domesticated 2000 BC? They had domesticated chicken. And there is a bird there that's the size of a chicken, the blue grouse, and they said this bird has hair. And so I thought, this bird has feathers on it. Well, then as I studied, I found out in the wintertime it grows very fine feathers on its legs, which some people have described as mouse's fur. And it does even look like mouse's fur on its legs.
So it's got 2 kinds of, what would we say, appendages on the skin.
Right.
Fur and feathers.
But what I'm saying really is that the Chinese were able to describe this bird
In
that's native to
detail.
North America in the right location in detail. And so place after place I found animals that some of the places I had to say, okay, what is this certain fish? Well, now it's extinct, but I was able to find record of it in that location. So place after place, they would name things that were native only to North America.
That's amazing.
And so how could they do that, writing this in China? Because we know it was quoted down through Chinese history. At one time, Chinese scholars had to study this for their civil service exams. So how would they know this in China, BC, unless somebody had been here and been back to describe it place after place?
And published sufficient books to get out to the general public.
Right.
It's fantastic.
Well, at one location, we get going down through Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico. At one location, someone else has found the names of the Shang Dynasty kings. And it was right where my path and his path intersected. I was on a north-south trail. He was on an east-west. He was following the old Route 66, which is Highway 40 now. And the name of it before it was Route 66 was National Old Trails Road. Someone can just Google that and find it on the computer. National Old Trails Road. So he has found a lot of Chinese writing. Now he's looked through thousands and thousands of petroglyphs, or etchings on rocks. Only a very small percentage is Chinese writing. But he has validated this with experts, other experts on Chinese writing, that it is Chinese writing.
Amazing.
So we have a lot of documentation on this. Now, another scholar has documented plants and microorganisms that maybe originated in the Americas, like peanuts, that are found in Chinese locations in 2 different provinces and carbon dated to before 2000 BC. So how did they get there unless someone had crossed the ocean and gone back? And then there are things in the Americas, like the banana leaf that's native to China, but it's found in ancient Peruvian tombs. And in ancient Peruvian tombs, we also find hookworm. The only way it could have arrived was by sea, because it couldn't have survived the cold northern route.
Right. It's amazing. Banana is a tropical fruit.
Right.
And in the scientific and literature, supposedly the Earth did a tilt, and the temperatures were very different than they are today, let's say. So different things grew in places where we wouldn't suspect that they could exist.
Possibly,
It's
but
quite fantastic to think of banana leaves.
right. Well, if they have
in
banana
that-
leaves, they would
in
have
that
to have the
location.
banana plants.
or something that looked like a banana
Right.
anyway. I'm
But
sure.
anyway, Carl Johannessen has over 100 items that originated on one continent and they're found on another continent. So,
People moved around.
and all of this was before 1492. His book is called World Trade and Biological Exchanges Before 1492, and he's a PhD in geography and in the study of plants.
You know what we need to do? We need to make a list of this, and if people, I don't want any work, but if people write in, we can at least put this on a website. Some
Well,
of these
there
references.
is an annotated bibliography that was done around 1990 that has, I think it has about 1,000 different references that were done by that period of time. And
Really?
yet still we can't, it talks about Chinese things coming to America or Asian things coming to America. It compares like the musical instruments that had the same 5 notes in the scale. It compares all kinds of different things coming from Asia to the Americas.
Yeah, there was a time when the exotic was very important. Some of the Chinese objects even ended up in the Caribbean, in places like St. Croix and St. Lucia and some of the other islands.
Right.
So people with money were trying to have these things imported from Asia.
Oh, one of the plants that Carl Johannessen wrote about was the Chinese mulberry, and that was in some of the locations on this trip. The Chinese Shan Haijing described mulberries, and sure enough, it was a Chinese variety that's growing wild there today. But Carl Johannessen documented that when the first Europeans arrived in the islands, that they said that the mulberry trees, the Chinese variety of mulberry trees, were already growing, and there was a huge number of them that were growing in the islands when they arrived. So
Okay. Well, it's quite fascinating. And the fact that you've done so much of this work. How many weeks were you traveling with your husband on, and he did a lot of the photographs? This
Right,
is well
right.
worth someone getting hold of a copy, and you're saying that Amazon has this?
yes, Amazon has that, and it's out as an ebook also.
Oh, really? Okay.
So some people prefer the ebooks because then you can really zoom in on it and see the different maps. But yes, that is available.
Okay.
Did Ancient Chinese Explore America? My Journey Through the Rocky Mountains to Find Answers. And I've included in this book a little bit of the history from the American Wild West. So if we're in a certain location, I might say, well, this restaurant has holes in the ceiling from when the
Shoot 'em ups. were
26
going on.
people died in this hotel from different times. They had gunfights, and so as I go through,
Pre-China.
right?
Pre-China.
It's a travelogue. This
Yes.
one is a little bit lighter than some of my other books because it's a travelogue and it tells about the different things along the way.
But the photography is excellent.
Well, thank
and
you.
your write-up is excellent. You don't extrapolate. You stick to the facts, and you put in any ideas that there may be more to this than you've discovered. But for a person of middle age using maps and doing the topography and the vegetation of the area and the animals, is just incredible.
Right, and I found a lot of academic studies that I was able to incorporate in this. For instance, I got to one place and they said, the Shanhai Jing, the Chinese document, said that there's an ailanthus tree in this area. And I've done quite a bit of hiking in the mountains and in Virginia area, and I said, I've never heard of an ailanthus tree. What is this? Well, then when I researched this a little bit more, I found out that it's called the tree of heaven. It's a tree that's native to China. So all this research on the internet, and thank God for the internet. You can find a lot of things. There was this academic study on this particular mountain of all the plants on this mountain, and 108 of them weren't native to the mountain. It's over 7,000 feet. And I thought, well, this is really strange. So one by one, I went through all these, found that 93 of the plants were ones that would have been used by Chinese. They were native to China, would have been used by the Chinese, and 69 of them were plants that were used in traditional Chinese medicine. So then I said, well, okay, maybe sometime in recent history Chinese people lived here. But I couldn't find anything in recent history that Chinese people had lived there.
Well, a lot of things are beginning to surface.
Right.
Papers and documents and even places, burial sites that have been unmarked.
Right.
I've turned up one or two that I've given to a friend of mine. But the point is that it's quite incredible that all this is under our nose and no one had done
Exactly.
any work or thought about it seriously because they were so embedded in this Bering Straits concept
Right,
of
right.
people coming over. And I don't know how they could do that when, if you look at some of the early Chinese vessels for plying the oceans, they are huge. They're about 4 or 5 times the size of what Columbus purported used to come to from Europe to the East Coast and to the Caribbean
Exactly.
islands and so forth. And what is even more interesting to me is if all these things were found here that relate to China, that a diverse number of Chinese people had to come. Those who could mine, those who knew something about medicines, those who knew something about minerals and jade,
Exactly.
and about their own history to put it on rocks and so forth. That it wasn't just a group of people, stray people who jumped on a boat and came over harum-scarum on a, what shall I say, a trip of escape from something.
Well, we might have both, you know, because if someone, say for instance, someone's out at sea and there's a typhoon comes up and they're caught in this current.
Right. They could be
Today
blown.
and back then, many Chinese families who were the fishermen lived on the boat with their wife
Right.
and children.
As they do in Hong
And-
Kong, yeah.
Right, and so they might, some of them might have come over. But this sounds like a purposeful trip. We're going to go, and they said, we want to chart the world. And that was another thing, too. If they came to America, they claim to have mapped the whole Earth. See, the whole Earth is shown on this.
Yes, yes.
So they, and there's, so I believe that other people need to pick up this and take the Shanhai Jing and compare it to say what they saw in other parts of the world. Is there evidence that Chinese went there too?
Yes.
But I think Chinese weren't the only ones that were traveling the oceans.
No.
No. And that I think sometimes we don't give the people in ancient times the credit they deserve, the intelligence they deserve.
Thank you.
That they could figure out the currents, they could go these places and trade together.
But they have to have been able, in so many ways, if we look at all the megaliths and all of the huge structures that still no one can figure out how they were constructed, and they were constructed,
Right.
and they were carved, and they had fields for games and this and that they were able,
Right.
very capable,
Right.
and knew a great deal about moving heavy structures. I think they underrate the fact that pulleys existed and these people had concepts of mathematics and pulleys that we haven't even thought about recently. It's
Exactly,
impossible
exactly.
that these things are all over the world, everywhere, and people just say, oh, they're nice. But when you stand next to one of those stones in Egypt that you can't even jump on because it's so high up, it would take being on two people's shoulders to get to the first stone.
Right. So they had to have had higher mathematics and geometry and trigonometry.
As you look at it, it is almost impossible. If it didn't exist and someone said it existed, people wouldn't believe it. We look at it and we can't even duplicate moving one stone or one block, whatever you want to call it.
Right, but it's not only in Egypt, but it would say
All
like
over
in
the
Peru
world,
and
the Easter Islands,
Right,
all
right,
over the world
right.
these are. And more material now is coming out about the place in England,
Stonehenge.
Stonehenge. A lot of statements and stuff is coming out about that, whether it's true or not, and so forth. And the alignment of many of these places with the solstice and with the rising of the sun and so forth, and the measurements are so
Right.
exact. And I keep saying, but the earth spins around and it travels around the sun, and how many times does it match up? That's my question. It's not being a
I
little
guess-
biologist and not being a big galactical thinking
I guess at the time of the
person.
different solstices it matches up, but that was one of the
But it
questions
wouldn't
that
match all the time because it's going around the sun as well as tilting as it goes around. So I'm wondering, how often is this a matchup?
you'll have to ask somebody.
No, I'm not asking you. You know, I'm just throwing this out, that we really have to think beyond what people tell us.
Right. Now, one of the things I bring up at the end of this book is that if you look at an aerial view of Stonehenge
Yes.
and you study a little bit about it, it also has 28 spokes. What we see is the hub, and it had 28 spokes. It had 56 posts with 28 spokes, and it also tells the solstices. So is it somehow related to the bighorn medicine whale, which they call the American Stonehenge?
And then you go to Peru,
Right.
and then you go to parts of Mexico, and you go to
Right.
Guatemala and all these other places, and you say, oh my goodness. If I had money, I would like to fly over parts of Mexico and Guatemala and see these from the air. I
See
don't
the
want,
lines that are set up?
well, just the structures that are remaining
Right.
with the vegetation invading it and what has tumbled out. I think that would make a marvelous tour,
Right. You're right.
and see it from the air. And then for the younger people,
Let them climb it.
go down on the ground.
Right.
And you look at it close up. But I'll be very happy with the aerial view, a low aerial view.
One of the things I want to say about this too
Yes.
is that people can follow that same route. Now, you don't have to climb all the 14,000-foot mountains. You can go to different locations and still get much of the same information.
It's just a magnificent
So
job.
I'm hoping that other people will follow that and double check, because I don't want to put out anything that's not truth. My whole object in this is trying to come to the truth about the matter of our history. And so I don't want to put out anything that's not truth.
Yeah, but it's you did a magnificent job. How long did it take you to put this together? I won't say
it
to
was-
write it. No, having the material, just putting it together is a horrendous job.
It was about a year, day and night. And when I visited you last time, I was just about through, and I was, I can't talk about that
Yes, you
yet.
can. Yes, you can. 'Cause
Well, you
did
don't talk
all
about the
work.
book until it's out. You know,
Well,
and
true, but the amount of work that went into this.
it was. And then, but my husband has just been wonderful in helping me. And when I was digging in the deepest part of this research, you know, he would make the bed, he would do the dishes, he would take care of everything. Just, you know, he understood the importance of this. And what was really interesting too is just as I was finishing up John and Linda Ruskamp, who were the ones that found the names of the early Chinese kings in New Mexico, they had, about a year earlier, said they were going to come visit us. They wanted to see Virginia. So, okay, and I'm keeping this top secret because I don't want anybody else to publish it before, I did. And so they're coming to visit, and I said, okay, I'm going to trust him. I'm going to let him see my manuscript. And that's when he revealed what he had just found. And he said, Charlotte, this has been here for thousands of years. Now, isn't it interesting that you just found it and I just found it? And our research fits together. It's almost like there's a purpose. Now is the time to tell the story. So we have been very supportive of each other. And just recently, he's found even more that's even more exciting. Near that location where he found the names of the Chinese kings, he found a rock that is the design of the 10-day. It's a forecast for the 10-day calendar. And at that period of time, China had a 10 days in their calendar. And there's a Chinese legend about the 10 suns, and I believe it's related to the 10-day calendar. But the way the legend goes is that each day a different sun came up. They took turns. And one day they all decided to come up at the same time. And so the archer had to shoot down the 9 of the suns because it was much too hot. Now, of course, we know that there's no way there are going to be 10 suns at the same time. But that's part of the legend. But where, according to the Chinese legend, where the 10 suns resided was in the Fusang tree. Now, Fusang is on my father's map where America is. So the 10 suns resided in Fusang. And some of the early Chinese writings said that they wanted to go to what we believe is the Grand Canyon to see the rising of the sun. And John just found a writing that says that they have visited the home of the sun, have been there for 10 years, and now they're going back. He's found this among other petroglyphs. And so it's just like, oh my goodness. But it's all in Chinese writing, and he has had it validated.
Wow. Were the Native Americans, does anyone know if the Native Americans had seen these petroglyphs?
Yes.
and wondered about them?
Yes. In fact, that was one of the things that John Ruskamp said. He was just at a conference in Ohio that I was at, and he talked on this. And he said that they checked it with the park rangers because certain tribes would claim certain petroglyphs. Okay, these are our petroglyphs, these are your petroglyphs, these are somebody else. But these with the Chinese writing on them, nobody claimed them. None of the Native Americans had claimed them. But they are in a protected area now because it's part of the National Park Service.
Incredible. Incredible. It gets more incredible if you keep talking. Keep talking.
It does. And I'm just thrilled with the many different things, over 100 things that Dr. Carl Johannesson has found. And then that he said that cotton in the New World cannot be spun or made into cloth. And yet in some of the ancient Peruvian tombs, they found cotton cloth. Now, the only way cotton in the New World could be spun into cloth if it's crossbred with cotton from the Old World. And Carl Johannesson has found that the New World cotton has the Asian strains of cotton in it. So they have these evidences from 2000 BC that people were somehow crossing the ocean. It's not something that could have floated across, that someone was coming over, purposely planning this,
and
weaving it into cotton cloth. So even if it had floated across, someone had to weave it into cotton cloth, know how to cross-pollinate.
And think there's a reason to do it.
Right. So we have all these, and then we have also the words, the languages. Now this is one area that people haven't studied as much. But there are many different Chinese words in some of the Native American languages. And my friend Suya Chan, she says that her native group, that they speak some of their words are the same. Now, some that you might recognize is, remember the old westerns, what the Indian would say? He'd say, how? You know, the Chinese expression is ni hao. So anyway, you know, a lot of the words are the same, and some of the Native Americans even have the Chinese expression, "Aya," which is a very Chinese way of saying a surprise, "Aya," you know. But the way that Suya's native ethnic group in China said turkey was the same that the Navajos say turkey. And I was even watching Dances with Wolves one time, and the Native Americans were speaking in that, and Kevin Costner offered them some food, and they said buyao, and that means I don't want it. In Chinese, it meant I don't want it. And the Indian was saying that. I said, what was that?
And because you recognize the word.
Right, right.
Well, I tell you, you have blown my mind, and I'm interested, and I'm sure the audience will find it interesting, and it should shake one or two people up who are interested in history, and perhaps they will look at it. And maybe you need to speak to some of the people in these Western universities who are doing master's and doctoral theses to begin to look at their environment in a different light, with different eyes.
Right, and my father said that other scholars need to dig deeper. So I welcome other people to join us.
Fine. I want to thank you so much for coming today. I've enjoyed the conversation. I've learned a lot. And we have these books, and we're not promoting books, we're promoting the information in books. So we don't sell on public access, but this is something that I implore you to take a look at, because we'll learn a lot about our own country. Thank you so much.
Thank you.